So there is a growing dispute between the church, and by this point, by the church, I mean the Catholic Church, the Western Church, and states, known as the investiture controversy. This has its origins in the feudal system and the dual roles that bishops had as both temporal and spiritual leaders. The Pope thought it was his authority alone to appoint bishops, but civil leaders, especially the Holy Roman Emperor, King, or Kaiser, thought it was under their authority as well. This really kind of comes to a head between Pope Gregory VII, who reigned between 1073 and 1085, and the Holy Roman Kaiser Henry IV, who reigned between 1050 and 1106. This was made only more complicated because previous emperors had actually appointed some of the popes. Gregory issues a very famous statement called the Saying of the Popes, or Dictatus Papae. Henry is upset with this, with these sayings, because one of them is that the Pope appoints bishops alone, and the king takes some troops to Italy to try and convince the Pope otherwise. Due to many factors, one being that Kaiser Henry had been deposed by Pope Gregory and excommunicated, and some of his own nobles had rebelled, Henry realizes his error, if you could say, and walks barefoot in winter in the Alps to the castle where the Pope was staying to ask for forgiveness and to be allowed to come back into this church. This controversy ends in pretty much a decisive victory for the church, because the determination is that the Pope, yes, will appoint the bishops, and then that the leaders of the civil world will give them any sort of civil authority that they may need. It also is about this time that we start to have really the College of Cardinals come into its own. And it's also decided from this point forward that the College of Cardinals will be the vehicle that a new pope is elected by. So that at this point, hopefully, there's very little influence from outside forces, various states, people voting for the Pope, but it will be just determined by the College of Cardinals. So the Cardinals have been around for 900 or 1,000 years or so. I want to do a little bit more table discussion here. What does the term crusade mean to you? Does it have a negative or positive connotation? And since we're talking about the Crusades, why do you think they may have occurred? And I'll give you my opinion afterwards. Well, I hope that that was some good table discussion. Now I'm going to go through what, at least my opinion on the Crusades. It may be different than some others, but go through some little bit of the factual things behind them. And hopefully we'll end up learning something at the end. So the Byzantine Emperor Alexis I saw the schism, the Great Schism between East and West, as an additional threat that the Byzantine Empire might not be able to recover from. Remember, the Byzantine Empire at one point was rather large, controlled modern-day Turkey, the Holy Land, Egypt, North Africa, but by this time it had really shrunk into areas really in just modern-day Turkey as well as Greece and such. So the empire was shrinking and it was combating Islam. And so the emperor thought that, without support from the Western church, that there's really no way that his empire can survive. So he kind of dangles a carrot when he contacts the Pope and says that he will offer to reunite East and Western churches. Remember, this is only about 40 years or so before or after the Great Schism. If Pope Urban II would help to bring some European knights that the emperor could command in battle to repel the Islamic invaders. And here's kind of a map to just kind of show you, but by this time the Byzantine Empire was a shadow of its former self. That's the remains of the Byzantine Empire, where at one time they controlled most of the lands here, and it's all controlled by Islamic forces now. Just to kind of refresh you, that's where Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. How's that go, Tim?
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Okay. The song, Constantinople, now it was Istanbul, or so. It was a song I heard once. So that's where the city of Constantinople, if you kind of forgot through everything I've talked about, is where it's at. So there's a quick little map there. The Byzantine Empire had lost its major breadbasket, the interior of Asia Minor, the interior of what the modern-day state of Turkey is, to a new enemy that gives the state of Turkey its name, the Turks. Just in case you forgot what that sounded like, here's our second cool history fact. A little bit of music to go with us too. Most of the Crusaders were not bloodthirsty savages bent on killing and rampages. From the movie Excalibur. Fortunately, I don't remember how long it plays. Most of the Crusaders were moved to restore Christian rule to the Holy Lands that had been taken over by Islamic forces. Note to self, stop this sooner next time. Previous Islamic rulers of the Holy Land had encouraged and allowed Christians to come to the Holy Land to worship. But these new folks, these Seljuk followers of Islam, did not allow the Christians to come, and in fact, they killed Christian pilgrims as well as the Jewish and Christian inhabitants of modern-day Palestine. The First Crusade from the year 1096 to 1099 was a rousing success, culminating in the capture or liberation, however you want to look at it, of Jerusalem and surrounding territories. However, the Crusaders broke their oath to the Byzantine Empire and refused to return the lands back to the Byzantines. They, in fact, founded various Crusader states based in the larger cities that they had conquered. However, Christians were restored to the Holy Lands, and important reconstructions of some of the churches in Israel were begun by the Crusades. The First Crusade also helped to reopen or rediscover trade routes that had been lost since the unified Roman Empire, and helped to restart international trade between East, including the Far East, and the West. Spoiler alert, that has some deadly consequences in about 200 years. The Crusader states and the surrounding Islamic states entered into a period of detente, or peace, for the next 40 years or so. But the loss of a northern city in this area triggers the Second Crusade, which lasts from about 1145 to 1149. The Crusader states lost territory, cities, and men from this point onward, including finally the city of Jerusalem in the year 1187. The Third Crusade, the one with King Richard of Robin Hood fame, 1189 to 1192, had some success, but was stopped due to the death of the Holy Roman leader and never reached Jerusalem. It, in fact, did end with a peace treaty that was supposed to be everlasting that would ensure Christianity have unfettered access to the Holy Lands. So a mere few years later, the Fourth Crusade is called, in the year 1202, to recapture Jerusalem. However, this is one of the most sad events of all of Christian history. Due to the scheming of the leader of Venice, the Crusades, instead of heading towards Egypt to attack Jerusalem, head towards the great city of Constantinople. They besieged and conquered the city. There's lots of different reasons why the Crusaders did this. The Crusading army was too small, and Venice had poured a lot of resources into building a navy to transport them to the Holy Land. There was a massacre of Catholics speaking Latin in Constantinople in the year 1182. There is a maritime rivalry between Venice and Constantinople for control of the sea routes and trade. The Crusaders were drawn into a dispute with the deposed emperor and his son, who promised enormous amounts of money if he were to be put back on the throne. So there's lots of different reasons why this unfortunate event happens. But the Pope who calls the crusade, Innocent III, when he heard of the siege, he excommunicated all those involved and wondered if our Eastern brothers and sisters can ever forgive us for this attack. This really is the final nail in the coffin between Eastern and Western Christianities, and really kind of still has effect to this day. While this, we call it the Latin Empire of Constantinople, was short-lived, it greatly weakens an already very fragile Byzantine Empire. So in the West, while the Crusades are occurring, there is increasing trade within and outside of Western Europe, and the modern states of Europe are slowly coalescing behind the strongest monarch in their area. So our saint future, well, pretty easy saint to pick for this time of the time period, would be St. Francis, who was born circa 1181 and died in 1226. Francis was born into a rich mercantile family, and he undertook some soldiering in central Italy. But after a pilgrimage to Rome, he returns to Assisi, and at the nearby church of San Damiano has his famous experience where Jesus on the cross told him to rebuild his church. Francis takes this literally, rebuilds the physical church that the cross resides in, and then understands that it's more of a worldwide thing, that Christ would like to see Francis rebuild the entire church. So he begins the Franciscans by preaching and living simply. Francis even travels to the Holy Land and sought an audience with the Sultan, the leader of the Islamic forces, in 1219 during the 5th Crusade. Depending on how you number crusades, there are 7, 8, 9. There is a children's crusade, but in the interest of time, I just focused on the first 4 tonight. Francis was moved to meet with the Sultan because he was upset that people would commit violence in the name of God against each other. No one is sure what it was said, but he was allowed to pass through Muslim lines and go to Jerusalem and speak with the Sultan. Another interesting fact about St. Francis, he was never ordained as a priest, as he felt unworthy to preside over the sacrifice of the Mass, and was only ordained as a deacon, which at this time was an extreme rarity because the diaconate was just seen as a stepping stone to priesthood. So men would get ordained as a deacon for a year or so, or 6 months, and then soon thereafter would be ordained as a priest. So for someone to just be ordained as a deacon like St. Francis was extremely, extremely rare. We also have at this time the growing university system in Western Europe that encourages theological debates concerning the Pope, councils, and the role of government. At this time, the Pope is in charge of central Italy, an area we call the Papal States, and so in some ways the Pope acted like any other monarch who wanted to expand his holdings. People such as St. Thomas Aquinas and Peter Lombard write great books and treatises on theology during this beginning of the universities. We also have this time frame the building of great cathedrals and churches in Northern Europe. With their incredibly high ceilings, flying buttresses, and large windows to let in light, Gothic architecture is a radical departure from the previous style, Romanesque. So here's a picture of a Romanesque church. You can see the windows are very, very small, not letting a lot of light in. And that's because people that built these churches thought they had to build these thick, stocky walls to hold all the weight of the roof. Well, about this time, it's determined that if you build a church where the walls don't support all the weight and the flying buttresses support the weight of the church, you in fact can have very, very large windows that let in lots of light. This is a picture of Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, pretty close to actually where Notre Dame is. And you can see how big the windows are and how much light is let in. On these stained glass windows, there could be a number of different things. Remember, most people are literate, so you may have Bible stories on here to teach people the stories of the Bible. You might have the lives of the saints to teach people the lives of the saints. You may have pictured important people who paid for that window to be built, or maybe the guild that paid for that window to be built. So a lot of different things would go on these windows. And here's the back of Notre Dame, another great church in Paris, kind of showing you the flying buttresses. You see where the weight is transferred from the walls, and that is how the walls are able to be thin, light, airy, and let in all this light. It's a wonderful experience if you haven't visited one of these churches to see all the light. It's very, very cool. Enough about buildings, back to our history a little bit. In the year 1261, the Byzantine Empire recaptures Constantinople. So it kicks out the Crusaders who had taken over the city. While the empire is still in a precarious position, a mini renaissance begins in the city that saw churches repaired, schools reopening, and classic culture and literature studied once again. There is, however, one more event that strikes both east and west. And I really wanted to find some dun 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 sound, but I couldn't for this one in the time. So I just found a scary dude. Well, this is the Black Death. It occurs in Europe between the year 1348 and 1350. It's caused by the newly rediscovered trade routes from the east. That was my little spoiler alert from earlier. It kills between 40 and 60% of Europe's population. It spreads quickly, and the only real defense was to run far and to run fast. The effects this has is it leads to kind of a dumbing down of the local clergy. Priests and monks were not adequately trained in theology, and essentially were ordained to give last rites. I'm not sure we have the numbers, but you can imagine that the mortality rate of those people that are coming in contact with those about to die from the Black Death would rather be pretty high. It also leads to a breakdown of the medieval system of economics and governance. So, where are we at as we end our discussion today? The Western Catholic Church and Eastern Orthodox Church are separated and not really talking to each other because of what happened during the Fourth Crusade. The Byzantine Empire is barely hanging on. The Pope is in charge of central Italy, some lands that we call the Papal States, and the Black Death has killed perhaps half of Europe's population. Hope I'm painting a bright picture here, folks. Some of the same issues that occur between Catholics and Orthodox reappear with the Protestant Reformation, especially the issue of the Pope. The Black Death, one of the consequences you can say is that the clergy that survives, afterwards the training system just is not there to adequately train them to be able to answer questions that the reformers bring, or the Protestant reformers bring. So, join me next week for the conclusion.